The summer Clara Whitmore came back to Pelican Cove. The old lighthouse had already been dark for 30 years. Just once. Nobody else seemed to notice. Or maybe they did, and they simply chose not to say anything. That was the way of Pelican Cove. Some things were left to shine quietly in the dark, and you let them. Clara noticed. She pulled her car to the side of the road, engine running, windows cracked against the warm July air. Her hands were loose on the steering wheel. Her heart was doing something strange. Not racing exactly, more like settling. Like a bird finally finding a branch after a long flight through wind and rain. She hadn't been back in 17 years. She hadn't been sure she'd ever come back at all. But here she was. And the lighthouse had blinked at her, like it was saying, "Welcome home, Clara. We've been waiting. Let me tell you about Pelican Cove, because the town is as much a character in this story as any person who lives in it." Pelican Cove sits on the northern coast of Maine, tucked between a long arm of granite cliffs and a wide, quiet harbor that turns silver in the morning and copper at sunset. The town has about 3,000 residents, and in July that number swells to maybe 4,000 as the summer people arrive. The families who rent the yellow cottage on Harbor Road, the retired couples who dock their sailboats at the old marina, the painters who set up easels along the pier and try, year after year, to capture the exact color of the fog. Nobody ever quite gets it right. The fog at Pelican Cove has its own particular quality. It isn't just gray. It's layered. Pale silver near the water, deeper blue-gray toward the treeline, and then, at the very top, almost lavender in the early mornings. People who grew up there stop seeing it after a while. But visitors always pause. They always look up. The main street is called Cove Road, and it runs along the waterfront for about 6 blocks before curving inland toward the old church and the elementary school. There's a general store that's been owned by the Bautista family for 4 generations. There's a diner called The Anchor that opens at 5 in the morning for the fishermen and closes at 2 in the afternoon when Greta Mullins, who has run it alone since her husband passed, decides she's done enough for one day. There's a used bookshop that smells like paper and sea salt and old coffee, and a little gallery that shows local artists, and a hardware store whose owner, Harold Finch, is 81 years old and still shows up every morning at 7:30 like clockwork. There's the Lighthouse. There's always been the Lighthouse. It was built in 1887, and for most of its life it was operated by the Whitmore family. Clara's great-great-grandfather was the first keeper, his son after him, and his son after that. The tradition passed down like a lantern passed hand to hand through generations, carefully with both palms, always watching the flame. Clara's father, James Whitmore, was the last. He tended the light until the Coast Guard automated the system in 1993, and then he didn't know what to do with his hands. She remembered watching her father stand on the bluff the night they turned the automated light on for the first time. He stood very still with his arms at his sides and watched the mechanical light do its work. Her father never quite recovered from that. But that's getting ahead of things. Let's go back to the night Clara arrived. She drove slowly down Cove Road with her window down, letting the night air in. It smelled like salt and seaweed and pine, and underneath all of that, something sweet. The wild roses that grew along the stone walls at the edge of town. She used to pick them when she was a girl. She used to press them between the pages of her books. The town was quiet at this hour. It was nearly 11 o'clock, and most of the lights were out except for the yellow glow of the Anchor sign. Greta always left it on, even at night, like a lighthouse of its own, and the warm windows of a few summer cottages along the waterfront. Somewhere a radio was playing something slow and old, a song from the 70s that Clara couldn't quite name but recognized somewhere in her chest. The kind of song you don't remember learning but somehow always know. She drove past the bookshop, past the gallery, past the hardware store where Harold Finch's old tomcat, a massive orange animal named Senator, was curled in the window display between a hand drill and a coil of rope. She stopped when she reached the house. Her father's house. Her house now, she supposed, though the paperwork still felt unreal. The property at 14 Whitmore Lane, including the lighthouse and associated keeper's cottage, has been left in its entirety to Clara and Whitmore. She'd read that sentence 4 times sitting in her apartment in Boston, the city humming and honking outside her window, and each time it felt like reading it in a foreign language. She hadn't spoken to her father in 3 years. Not since the last fight, the one about her not coming home for Christmas, which was really a fight about the years before that Christmas, and the year before that one, and the long slow drift that had happened between them while neither of them was paying close enough attention. And then he had died in April, quietly, in his sleep, with his bedroom window open and the sound of the harbor coming in on the breeze. The neighbor, a woman named Dorothy Haynes, had found him. She told the lawyer he looked peaceful. The lawyer had told Clara. Clara had sat in her car in the parking garage beneath her office building in Boston and let herself cry for exactly 11 minutes. Then she'd gone upstairs and answered emails. She wasn't proud of that. The house was a white clapboard Cape Cod with green shutters and a stone chimney and a front porch that wrapped halfway around to the side yard. The porch boards had always creaked in the same places. The third step, the wide board by the front door, the corner near the old rocking chair where her father used to sit in the evenings with his coffee and his binoculars, watching the harbor. The rocking chair was still there. Clara sat in her car in the driveway for a long time, engine off, listening to the engine tick and cool in the darkness. The lighthouse was visible from here, up on the bluff, its white tower catching the moonlight. Still now, no more pulses of light, just the moon and the dark water and the sound of the waves, steady and patient, the way they'd always been. She got one suitcase from the back seat and left the rest for tomorrow. She climbed the porch steps. Third one creaked, exactly as she'd known it would, and used the key the lawyer had mailed her and stepped inside. The smell hit her first. Every house has its own smell, and your childhood home has a smell unlike anything else in the world. You don't know it until you walk back through the door after years away, and then it lands on you like a hand on your shoulder. Soft, certain, familiar in a way that goes deeper than memory. Her father's house smelled like wood smoke and books and lemon oil and, beneath all of that, the faint mineral scent of the sea. The same as it always had. Exactly the same. Then she found the kitchen, filled a glass of water from the tap, and sat at the old wooden table where she had eaten approximately 10,000 meals as a girl. The table where she'd done homework, and argued with her father, and learned to play cards on rainy afternoons, and been comforted after bad days at school, and celebrated small victories, and sat in silence on the hard mornings when her mother's absence was loudest. Her mother had left when Clara was 6. Not dramatically, not in a storm of shouting and slamming doors. She'd simply grown quieter over the months and then one morning was gone. She'd sent birthday cards until Clara was 12, and then even those stopped. Clara's father had never spoken badly about her. He just said, gently, every time Clara asked, "Some people aren't built for staying, sweetheart. That doesn't mean they don't love you. It just means they don't know how to show it from close up. That doesn't mean they don't love you." She'd carried that sentence with her like a permission slip. An explanation for why she kept her apartment sparsely furnished, why she didn't collect things, why she'd left Boston before Boston could leave her, why she'd never really let anyone past a certain point. She thought she understood. Sitting in her father's kitchen at 11:30 at night, she was beginning to wonder if she'd misunderstood completely. She slept in her old bedroom, which her father had kept as a kind of gentle museum. Not exactly the same as when she was a child, but careful. The same quilt on the bed. Though it had been washed so many times it had faded from deep blue to a soft gray blue, the color of early morning sky. She lay in the dark and listened to the waves. She was asleep before she finished a single thought. In the morning, Pelican Cove was all gold and salt air and the sound of gulls. Clara woke at 6:30 to light coming through the thin curtains, painting long warm stripes across the faded quilt. For about 5 seconds, the beautiful, brief amnesia of first waking. She didn't know where she was. Then it all settled back down on her. The house, the town, the lighthouse, her father's empty chair on the porch. She made coffee in the old percolator she found in the cabinet above the stove. Her father had never owned a drip machine. He'd always said percolator coffee tasted like coffee was supposed to taste, which was a theory Clara had argued with as a teenager, and now, standing in his kitchen with the summer morning coming through the window, found herself completely agreeing with. She took her mug out to the porch. The harbor was gorgeous. She'd forgotten how gorgeous it was, or maybe she'd made herself forget, the way you sometimes make yourself forget beautiful things that belong to complicated places. The water this morning was that particular shade of blue-green that you only get in summer in Maine, deep and clean and cold-looking even in the warmth of July. A few lobster boats were already out, their engines a low, steady rumble across the water. The village below was beginning to wake. She could see a figure opening the shutters at the general store, and the anchor sign had clicked off, which meant Greta was probably already inside and already on her third cup. The lighthouse stood up on the bluff to her left, white against the blue morning sky, completely still. The iron railing on the gallery at the top was a little rusted, but the tower itself was solid, all that New England granite, built to last against whatever the Atlantic could throw at it. Clara sipped her coffee and looked at it for a long time. Then she went inside, found her father's old walking boots in the hall closet. Still there, still in their spot, laces neatly tied the way he always left them, and went up to the lighthouse. The path up the bluff was overgrown but not impassably so. Goldenrod and Queen Anne's lace had crept in from both sides, and the stepping stones were mossy, but the path itself was still there, still solid, carved into the hillside over 130 years of Whitmore feet going up and down. Clara climbed slowly, pausing once to look back at the harbor. From up here, the view was breathtaking. The whole cove spread out below, the village, the pier, the lobster boats, the far green shore on the other side of the water. And beyond the mouth of the cove, the open Atlantic, stretching out to the horizon in a vast flat expanse of blue. She used to come up here with her father almost every evening when she was small. He'd check the light, make sure everything was functioning properly, and she'd sit on the granite ledge near the base of the tower and watch the water change colors as the sun went down. He'd tell her the names of the stars as they appeared. He'd taught her to read weather by the color of the western sky. He told her the stories of every ship that had ever gone down along this coastline, not to frighten her, but because he believed it was important to remember. That's what the light is for, Clara. Not just to guide them, to say you are seen. You are not alone out there. She was crying by the time she reached the lighthouse door. Quietly, the way adults cry when they're surprised by grief, no dramatics, just the sudden and unstoppable business of tears. Then she wiped her eyes, straightened up, and tried the door. It was unlocked, but the door swung open easily on its old hinges, and the smell that came out was simply cold stone and sea air and something like old wood polish. Not neglect exactly, more like a room that had been resting, waiting. The interior of the lighthouse was a single circular room at the base with a cast iron spiral staircase rising up through the center. The walls were stone, thick and cool, and the light came in through two small windows, each about the size of a dictionary. There were hooks on the wall where her father used to hang his rain gear, an old wooden chair, a shelf with a few rusted tools, a lantern, not an electric one, but an old kerosene lantern, the kind you'd carry by hand. The lantern was lit. Clara stared at it. The hair on the back of her neck rose, but not from fear, from something more like awe. She crossed the room slowly, as if moving quickly might extinguish whatever spell was keeping the flame alive. Someone had lit this recently, sometime in the last 12 hours. She looked around the room again. Nothing else was disturbed. Nothing else was different. Just the lantern, burning quietly in the corner, as if someone had left a light on for her. She sat in the old wooden chair and put her coffee mug in her lap and sat very still, letting the quiet of the lighthouse settle around her. The flame moved very slightly in some draft she couldn't feel. The walls glowed in its warm light. She stayed there for a long time. She met Dorothy Haynes that afternoon. Dorothy was 73, compact and wiry, with white hair cut short and eyes the color of old denim, that particular faded blue that somehow manages to be both soft and sharp at the same time. She lived in the cottage next door to Clara's father's house and had lived there for 40 years. She'd been the one to find him. She'd been the one who kept the house watered and dusted and aired out for the month between his death and Clara's arrival. She came by at 2 o'clock with a pan of blueberry buckle, still warm, wrapped in a clean dish towel. She said, I figured you might not have had time to grocery shop." She handed it over at the door without a trace of ceremony. She had that Maine directness that Clara had grown up with, the kind that isn't rude, just efficient. People in Pelican Cove didn't waste words on preamble when actions said things better. "Thank you," Clara said. "Do you want to come in?" Dorothy looked at her steadily for a moment. "I think I might," Clara said, and was surprised to find she meant it. They sat at the kitchen table with plates of blueberry buckle and tea. Clara had found a box of her father's Earl Grey in the cabinet, and talked for 2 hours. Dorothy told her about the last few years of her father's life, the details the lawyer couldn't or wouldn't relay. She told them carefully, like someone who understood that these pieces were precious, not to be handled carelessly. He'd been happy, Dorothy said. Not in a grand way, in the way that quiet, stubborn people are happy, which is to say he'd found a rhythm and he'd kept it. He walked every morning to the harbor to watch the boats go out. He read voraciously 2 or 3 books a week. He had dinner most Thursdays with Harold Finch from the hardware store, the 2 of them playing chess and arguing about baseball. He'd taken up watercolor painting in his last 2 years, and while he wasn't especially talented, he'd painted the Lighthouse about 40 times, each version slightly different, each one hung somewhere in the house. Each one painted with the specific and slightly imperfect care of someone who wasn't trying to produce art, just trying to hold on to something. Clara hadn't noticed them the night before. Now she looked around and saw them. Small watercolors in simple frames, hung at odd heights all through the kitchen and the hallway, in the living room above the fireplace, in the little reading nook by the back window. The lighthouse from below, the lighthouse from the harbor, the lighthouse at sunset, at dawn, in fog, in snow, in the particular golden light of late September. Each one painted with the specific and slightly imperfect care of someone who wasn't trying to produce art, just trying to hold on to something. Clara's throat tightened. "He talked about you," Dorothy said simply, "not as an accusation, just a fact." "What did he say?" Dorothy considered this. "He said you were like this coast. He said, 'She looks formidable from a distance, but up close she's just made of beautiful, stubborn things.' He was proud of you. He was proud of you." Clara put her tea down. She looked at the window, at the harbor beyond it, at the boats coming in for the afternoon. "We wasted a lot of time," Clara said. "Most people do," Dorothy said. "Not unkindly, just factually. The grace of it is you're here now." The question of the lantern stayed with Clara. She asked Dorothy about it that afternoon, whether her father had ever mentioned anyone else having access to the lighthouse, whether there was a caretaker she didn't know about, whether the Historical Society or the Coast Guard or anyone else might have reason to go up there. Dorothy set her teacup down very carefully. She had a specific way of pausing before she answered certain questions, and Clara was beginning to learn what it looked like. "I expect. Who's Eli Warren?" "He's the one who's been keeping an eye on things since your father passed. Old friend of your father's, or not so old, comparatively. He came to Pelican Cove about 8 years ago. Bought the old boatyard on the south side of the harbor, fixed it up. He's a good man." Another small pause. "He's the one who tends the lighthouse." "He tends the lighthouse? Does he know it's not his lighthouse to tend?" Dorothy almost smiled. "Almost." Another small pause. "He knows. He also knows it would have broken your father's heart to see it go entirely dark." She stood up and smoothed the front of her cardigan. "That's his boat. Named it after his grandmother. You'd know her by the red stripe on the hull." Clara found him the next morning. The boatyard was on the south end of the harbor, past the marina and the fish pier, around the curve of the shore to where the water got quieter and the smell of sawdust and marine paint replaced the salt and diesel of the working waterfront. Eli Warren was on the dock beside his boat. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, lean and weathered in the particular way that Maine coastal men get. The sun and the salt air doing their long work on a face that would have been conventionally handsome before and was now just deeply interesting. He had gray at his temples and paint on his forearms, and he was kneeling on the dock with a piece of sandpaper, working on a section of the hull with the kind of patient, unhurried attention that Clara associated with a different era. The boat was beautiful. 40 feet, wooden, with lines that suggested something from the 1950s, classic and purposeful. And along her hull, a single red stripe, clean and bright as a ribbon. Clara walked down to the dock. "You must be Clara," Eli said, without looking up from his sandpaper. His voice was quiet and unhurried, the way his hands were. "Dorothy called me." He glanced up then, and his eyes were a light, clear gray, the color of the harbor in early morning. Clara blinked. "Was I making an expression? You were studying this boat like it owed you an answer." He set down his sandpaper and stood, wiping his hands on a rag from his back pocket. "Eli Warren," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you." She shook his hand. "I'm sorry about your father. James was a good man. The lantern was lit when I got there 2 nights ago. A kerosene lantern inside at the base of the tower. That was me. I go up most nights to check on things. When I heard you were coming, I lit the lantern. Your father used to say his family always kept a light burning for people coming home." Clara stood on the dock in the July morning and looked at this man she'd never met, who had spent years watching over a lighthouse that wasn't his out of loyalty to a man who was gone now, and had lit a lantern to welcome her home because he'd heard she was coming. She didn't know what to say, so she said the only true thing she had, "Thank you." "You're welcome," and went back to his sandpaper. July in Pelican Cove moved the way July always does in small coastal towns. Slowly, warmly, with that quality of time that is particular to summer by the water, where the days seem to stretch and loosen at the edges, where you look up from whatever you're doing and realize you've been sitting on the porch for 2 hours watching the light change and it didn't feel like time passing at all. Clara began to settle into the house. She aired out the rooms, opened windows she suspected hadn't been opened in months, laundered the curtains and hung them back while the salt breeze came through. She went through her father's things slowly, carefully, in the way that grief asks you to, not trying to rush the feeling, just opening drawers and closets and letting whatever was inside be what it was. She found his logbooks in the study. There were 37 of them spanning the last 30 years. Clara sat on the floor of the study with the afternoon light coming through the window and opened the most recent one, dated the winter just past. January 14th. Cold and clear. Ice on the harbor this morning. Walked to Greta's for breakfast. She made the good oatmeal with the brown sugar and pecans. Harold is convinced the Red Sox are going to make a run this season. I told him he has the faith of a man who has clearly suffered enough to believe in miracles. He didn't appreciate that as much as I thought he would. Clara's birthday is next week. I thought about calling. I'll think about it again tomorrow. The distance between two people who love each other is mostly made up of calls that didn't happen. Clara pressed her hand flat on the page. Read it again. I'll think about it again tomorrow. January 20th. Clara's birthday. Didn't call. Don't know how to start the conversation from here. February 3rd. Didn't send the letter. Rewrote it 4 times. None of them sound right. What sounds right is what I can't write, which is, I'm sorry I didn't know how to hold on to you when your mother left. I was so busy trying not to fall apart that I forgot to teach you it was safe to stay. I built the walls to protect you and then was confused when you used them the way I built them, to keep the storms out. Clara, the storms were never coming from inside this house. Clara closed the logbook. She sat very still on the study floor for a long time. Outside, the harbor kept doing what harbors do. The boats moved. The water shifted. The gulls called back and forth to each other over the water. The afternoon light moved slowly across the room, painting a golden square on the braided rug. After a while, Clara got up, made a cup of tea, and went to find Eli. She found him where Dorothy said she usually would in the afternoons, aboard the Estelle, not working, just sitting at the stern with a thermos and looking out at the water. She sat beside him. He poured her some coffee from his thermos without asking. It was the good kind, dark and strong, the kind that had been brewed with real attention. They sat together and looked out at the harbor for a while without talking. This, Clara thought, was another thing she'd forgotten about places like Pelican Cove. The way some silences were comfortable. The way some people understood that quiet wasn't empty. How long were you friends with my father? Since I got here 8 years ago. He was the first person in this town who talked to me like he wasn't deciding whether I was going to work out. He always beat everyone at chess. He was proud of that. He talked about you learning chess. He was proud of that. Yeah, Eli said quietly. He was working on that. The harbor light was going amber and copper now. A lobster boat was coming in, its wake spreading out behind it in a long V. I found his logbooks. He wrote a lot about things he should have done differently. He was good at that, at knowing when not to fill the space. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. The difference is I still have time. He didn't get the chance. What are you going to do about that? I haven't decided yet. I think I'm going to stay for a while. He looked at her then. Good, he said, and went back to looking at the harbor. She stayed. August came, and with it the fullness of Maine summer. The long, brilliant days, the warm evenings when the whole village seemed to exhale together and settle on porches and decks and the wooden benches along the waterfront. The water in the cove was warm enough to swim by the first week of August, and the children did, leaping off the end of the pier in the late afternoons while their parents watched from the grass above the beach. She began to feel the town again, the way you feel a familiar piece of clothing you haven't worn in years. A little surprised by how well it still fits. She had breakfast at the Anchor most mornings, and Greta, who had an unerring instinct for what people needed, sometimes just brought food without taking an order, and it was always right. She helped Harold Finch reorganize the back storage room at the hardware store one rainy afternoon when he mentioned once that it had gotten away from him, and she spent 3 hours there while Harold sat on a stool and supervised and told her stories about growing up in Pelican Cove 60 years ago, when the fish cannery was still running and the whole southern end of the harbor smelled like sardines from April to October. She spent a lot of time at the boatyard. She and Eli fell into a kind of wordless routine. She'd appear in the mornings, he'd hand her a task, and they'd work alongside each other with the radio playing and the harbor sounds coming in off the water. She learned to sand and prime and varnish. She learned the names of tools she'd never held. She learned that Eli had come to Pelican Cove 8 years ago from Vermont, that he'd been a civil engineer before that he'd left after his wife died, and he'd needed, in his words quietly without drama, a different kind of life. He didn't tell her all of this at once. Came out in pieces over several weeks, the way true things tend to. Not announced, just gradually revealed, like details emerging from fog as you move closer. She told him things too. About Boston, about the job she'd left. 8 years as a landscape architect at a firm she'd mostly liked but never quite loved. About the apartment she'd packed in 3 days when the lawyer called. About the relationships she'd kept at a careful arm's length and the one she hadn't kept at all because she'd pushed too hard against the walls she'd built to keep herself safe from the exact feeling she was having right now. The feeling of belonging somewhere, of being seen. Your father knew. That's a very poetic interpretation of real estate. He did smile then. A real one, the kind that reorganized his whole face. Yeah, well, I spent a lot of time with a poet. It was in the 3rd week of August that the mystery of the lighthouse fully unfolded. Clara had been going up to the tower regularly, not to do anything in particular, but because she found the space clarifying. The cool stone walls, the iron spiral staircase, the small windows at each landing that gave you different views of the coast as you climbed. She'd started bringing a book and sitting at the base of the lantern room in the afternoon, reading in the light that came through the great glass lens, thick and prismatic, breaking the sunlight into something extraordinary. One afternoon she found a box she hadn't noticed before, tucked into the alcove beneath the staircase, behind a loose stone in the wall. It was a tin box, the kind that used to hold Christmas cookies, with a painted poinsettia faded on the lid. She sat down cross-legged on the cool stone floor and opened it. Inside were letters, a small bundled stack of them, tied with a piece of blue ribbon that had faded to the same gray blue as the old quilt on her bed. They were written on the kind of thin onion skin paper that people used to use for letters meant to travel long distances, light, translucent, the ink showing faintly through from the other side. The handwriting on the envelopes was her mother's. Clara recognized it from birthday cards she'd received as a child, careful, looping cursive, the letters even and well-spaced, the kind of handwriting taught in a different era when penmanship still meant something. The name on the envelopes was her father's. She sat for a long time without opening them. The light moved through the lens above her, slow and golden. The waves were a steady rhythm far below. A bird called somewhere outside. A tern, she thought, their sound always a little wild and questioning. She opened the first letter. It was dated 15 years ago, and it began. James, I know you have no reason to read this. I know you have every reason to put it in the fire. But I've been thinking about Clara for 2 years now. Ever since I heard from an old friend in Pelican Cove that she'd gone to Boston for school and was building a life there. She sounds, from what little I can learn at a careful distance, like someone I would admire very much. Which tells me more about you than it does about me, and I wanted you to know that I know that. And the 14 letters were not dramatic. They were not confessional in the way of someone who needed absolution. They were letters from a woman who had spent years reckoning honestly with herself, and who had written to the man she'd left. Not asking for forgiveness exactly, though that was underneath everything, but simply trying to account for herself. To explain, as clearly as she was capable of, what had happened and why. The depression she'd never told anyone about. The terrible and suffocating feeling, in those years when Clara was small, that she was disappearing inside her own life. The terrifying certainty, which she had since learned was a symptom of a sickness she'd had untreated for years, that leaving was the only thing that would keep her from doing something worse. She had gotten better. She had gotten help. She had rebuilt her life carefully and imperfectly. She had thought about Clara every single day. The last letter was dated 2 years ago. It said, Dorothy and I have written to each other for years. I hope that's all right. She says you paint the lighthouse over and over. I looked up a kind of art therapy they do now, where you paint the thing you love until you understand what you love about it. I think you're painting the lighthouse until you understand why you stayed when I couldn't. I think the answer, James, is that you were always built for the long watch, the patient light, the steady staying. And I am so sorry it took me until now to understand that wasn't a failure of mine. It was a different kind of gift. Clara sat in the lighthouse until the sun was nearly down. And then she carried the tin box back to the house and she called Dorothy. Dorothy arrived within 10 minutes. She sat at the kitchen table while Clara made tea. And she didn't pretend not to know what was coming. When Clara set the tin box on the table between them, Dorothy simply folded her hands and waited. You knew, your father asked me to write to her. A long time ago, he felt, and I believe this was right, that he'd never be able to answer her, but he didn't want the door to be completely closed. So he asked me to write, to let her know things were all right here, to let her know about you. Not details, nothing she hadn't lost the right to know, just that you were well, to keep the door open. Dorothy looked at the tin box. I kept it up because I thought it was kind, both for her and for him. Where is she now? She's in Bar Harbor, about 2 hours up the coast. Clara's hands were still on the table. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the evening was coming in, the sky over the harbor turning from blue to a long pale gold. Is she well? She is. She's been well for a long time. She has a small garden and she teaches piano to children on Saturday mornings. She has a cat named after a president, though she won't tell anyone which one. She is a very ordinary woman who did a very painful thing and has spent a long time being sorry for it. The silence stretched between them for a long moment. I don't know if I want to see her. You don't have to decide that tonight. I know. She looked at the tin box. But I think I want to write to her. First, Dorothy reached across the table and put her hand over Clara's. Her hand was small and warm and very certain. I think that's exactly right, she said. September came the way it always does in coastal Maine. Decisively, overnight almost, the light changing from the wide flat gold of summer to something thinner and more slanted, the shadows longer, the evenings arriving earlier and cooler. The tourists filtered away. The summer cottages went dark and shuttered. The village contracted back to itself, and there was a particular quiet that came in those first weeks of September. Not emptiness, but intimacy. Clara found that she didn't want to leave. She had extended her stay once, then again, and at some point in late August she'd stopped thinking of it as extending her stay and started thinking of it as simply living there, which was a different thing entirely. She'd driven up to Boston on a Saturday, collected the rest of her things, handed her keys to her landlord, and driven back down Cove Road on a Sunday evening just as the sun was setting over the harbor. Senator the cat had been watching from the hardware store window as she passed. She'd felt, driving back down that road with a car full of books and plants and the particular detritus of a life being relocated, an almost physical sense of rightness, of falling back into the shape she'd been meant to be all along. She had also, quietly and without announcement, begun applying her landscape architecture knowledge to the grounds around the lighthouse. The property was large, a full acre around the keeper's cottage and the tower, and decades of moderate neglect had given it a certain wild beauty, but also some genuine chaos. She began working through it the way her father had worked through his logbooks. Slowly, with care, not trying to impose order so much as find the order that was already there and help it along. She planted things. She cleared the path to the lighthouse properly, laid new stepping stones alongside the old ones. She rescued the old stone walls from the ivy that had been dismantling them for years. She put in a kitchen garden at the south side of the cottage where the sun was best, and spent a long September afternoon with Dorothy identifying what was already growing there. Thyme and lavender, and a sprawling rosemary bush her father must have planted years ago, and a rose that had gone completely feral and wonderful. She was working in the garden on a clear September afternoon when Eli appeared at the gate with 2 sandwiches from the general store and the expression of a man who was trying not to say something. "What?" she said. "Nothing. You have a face." He handed her a sandwich and sat on the stone wall. "I was going to take the Estelle out this weekend. Run her up the coast as far as Scudic before the weather turns. I thought you might want to come." "Good," and opened his sandwich. They left on Saturday morning in the pale early light, when the harbor was silver and still and the lobster boats were just beginning to move out toward the open water. The Estelle was magnificent underway. The classic lines that looked beautiful at dock became something altogether more alive when she was moving, the red stripe cutting cleanly through the green water, the engine a deep and satisfying rumble, the whole boat settling into the sea with the ease of something that understood its purpose exactly. They went up the coast slowly, with no particular hurry. The Maine coast unfolded beside them. The granite headlands, the dark fir forests coming down to the water's edge, the occasional white house on a bluff, the small islands lying offshore in the morning light. Seals hauled out on a flat ledge near one of the islands and watched the Estelle pass with the mild, contemplative curiosity of creatures who have seen boats before and found them interesting but not urgent. Clara sat at the bow with her coffee and the wind in her face and felt, for the first time in what felt like a very long time, entirely present. Not thinking about the past. Not the logbooks, not the letters, not the years she'd spent in careful self-sufficient distance from everything that might have held her. Not thinking about the future either. Just here, in this moment, on this boat, on this particular stretch of Maine coast, in the company of a man who had lit a lantern to welcome her home. Somewhere around mid-morning, Eli came forward and sat beside her, and they watched the coast in comfortable silence. After a while he said, quietly and without preamble, "I'm glad you stayed." "So am I," Clara said. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The water said the rest of it. The steady movement of the boat through the swells, the light dancing off the surface, the coast of Maine in all its hard and beautiful abundance flowing past like something from a dream you're grateful to be still inside. She wrote the letter to her mother in October. She'd written and discarded 7 drafts before she found the one that felt true. It wasn't long. It wasn't an absolution or an accusation or a careful legal document of grievances. It was simply the truth in the most direct form she could manage. That she'd found the letters. That she'd read them. That she needed some time to be with what she'd read. That she hadn't thrown the letter away, and she was going to send this one, and she was willing to see what happened next. She walked to the post office on a clear October morning with the last of the leaves blazing orange and gold along Cove Road, and she dropped the letter through the slot, and she stood there for a moment with her hand still near the slot, listening to the small silence that follows doing a hard thing. Then she walked back to the lighthouse. She climbed the iron stairs all the way to the top, up past the small windows with their different views, up through the cool and ancient dark of the tower, up into the lantern room with its great prismatic lens. She stood at the railing of the gallery and looked out. The view from up here was extraordinary. The whole of Pelican Cove below, the village, the harbor, the boats at the dock, the white-clapboard houses climbing the hill, the general store, the hardware store, Harold Finch's tomcat in the window, Greta's diner, Dorothy's cottage, Eli's boatyard with the Estelle at the dock, her red stripe visible from up here. And beyond the cove, the open ocean, the Atlantic in October wearing its autumn colors, deeper blue, greener, with white caps on the swells and the first dark clouds of a coming storm far out on the horizon. Every name mattered, her father had said. Every soul that ever crossed this water mattered. That's what the light is for, Clara. She thought about her father, who had stood in this exact spot thousands of times. She thought about his logbooks and his terrible pot roast and his watercolors of the lighthouse, each one a little different, each one his attempt to understand what he loved about it. She thought about his letter that he'd never sent, and the thing he'd said in it that she carried with her now like a stone worn smooth in the pocket. She'll outlast everything. She thought about Eli below somewhere, working on a boat with patient and unhurried hands. She thought about Dorothy next door, drinking tea and reading something sensible and keeping the warmth of the known world functioning at its ordinary, essential temperature. She thought about Harold Finch, who showed up every morning at 7:30, 81 years old, because the world needed hardware and reliability and the specific comfort of someone being exactly where they said they'd be. She thought about the letter she'd just dropped in the slot at the post office. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know what the letter would lead to, what the winter would look like, what it would feel like to be in this town for the first dark months with the harbor ice and the quiet streets and the long nights. She didn't know what she and Eli were to each other, exactly, or what they might become, or whether the careful and perfect architecture of two people who've both learned the hard way to guard their inner rooms could ever make something with open doors. That evening, Clara cooked dinner for the first time in her father's kitchen. Really cooked, not just toast and eggs but an actual meal. The lamb stew her father used to make on cold fall nights, the recipe written on a card in his handwriting that she found tucked in the back of the old joy of cooking on the shelf above the stove. She invited Dorothy and Eli, and at 6 o'clock they were all three sitting at the old kitchen table with bowls of stew and a loaf of bread from the general store and a bottle of red wine that Eli had brought. Dorothy told a story about Harold Finch's cat that left all three of them crying with laughter. Eli told a story about his first attempt at repairing a boat hull that ended with 3 inches of water in the boatyard. Clara told the story of the landscape project she'd done in Boston where the client had specifically requested a garden that didn't look like nature, and the resulting 6 months of her professional life. The stew was good. Not quite her father's. She'd used the wrong kind of bay leaf, she thought, and slightly too much time, but close. Close enough. Later, after Dorothy had gone home through the connecting garden gate, and after the dishes were done and the wine was finished, she and Eli sat on the front porch in the dark, each in one of the old chairs, looking out at the harbor. The lighthouse was visible up on the bluff, the little kerosene lantern burning steadily in the lantern room window, just a small warm point of light against the dark. He was quiet for a moment. Eli turned to look at her. I know, he was quiet for a moment. Then, I know someone who knows the electrical, and I can help with the structural work on the gallery. I know you can. Another long, easy silence. The night kept doing its quiet work. The lighthouse lantern kept burning. The lighthouse wasn't talking about the lighthouse. She knew that. He knew that she knew. And the night settled around them like something finally come to rest, warm and dark and full of stars, the harbor breathing softly below, the lighthouse burning above, and between those two constants, the quiet miracle of two people sitting in the October dark and feeling, simply and completely, at home. The lighthouse was relit on the 1st of December. It was Eli's idea to make a small ceremony of it. Just the people who mattered on the bluff in the December cold, with coats and thermoses and the particular determination of people who believe some things are worth standing in the cold for. Dorothy was there, in her enormous red wool coat, looking pleased with everything. Harold Finch was there in his old parka, Senator the cat inexplicably in his arms. Harold claimed the cat had followed him and he couldn't very well leave him in the December cold, and nobody challenged this. Greta Mullins was there, having closed the anchor early for only the 3rd time in 11 years. Clara climbed the lighthouse alone. She climbed all the way up the iron staircase in the dark, past the small windows, up into the lantern room where the restored light sat waiting, the original Fresnel lens cleaned and polished, the electric mechanism rebuilt behind it, everything ready and precisely done. She stood at the switch for a moment. She thought about her father. She thought about all the men before him all the way back to 1887, who had stood in this exact room and tended this exact light. She thought about the ships that had used it, and the crews who had seen it and been glad, and the people on shore who had watched it and felt, in its steady rhythm, a kind of reassurance so deep it was almost prayer. She thought about the letter she'd received from Bar Harbor 2 weeks ago. Short, careful, honest, the same qualities as the letters in the tin box, the same voice, a little older. It had said, "I would very much like to meet you if you're willing. I understand completely if you're not. But if you are, I'd like to offer you tea and the chance to figure out what we are to each other. I think we might be more than we've been. I think we might have your father's stubbornness in common." She'd written back, "I'll come in the spring." And she would. She put her hand on the switch. She threw it. The light came on. From below on the bluff, she heard a small sound rise up. Not quite a cheer, more like a collective exhale. The sound of people releasing something they'd been holding. She climbed the last few steps to the gallery and stepped outside into the cold December night. And the light swept around her in its great slow arc, out across the harbor and across the dark water beyond. The village below was lit up in December lights. Strings of white along Cove Road, the decorated window at the general store, the warm yellow of the anchor sign. And reflected in the harbor, all of it, wavering and bright on the dark water. And now, added to all of that, the lighthouse beam, sweeping out, coming back, sweeping out. You are seen. You are not alone out there. Below her, she could see them. Dorothy in her red coat. Eli looking up at the light with an expression she knew now and would know for a long time. Harold Finch with his ridiculous cat. Greta with her thermos. Her people. This place. This stubborn, beautiful, saltwater and pine and old wood place that had kept a light burning for her while she was away. The beam swept out across the dark water. And the water held it the way water holds all light, imperfectly, beautifully, in pieces, each one still somehow adding up to something whole. That night, after the ceremony and after the small gathering in the keeper's cottage, warm and crowded and loud with Harold's stories and Dorothy's laughter and Greta's excellent coffee, and the particular happiness of a room full of people who are exactly where they're supposed to be. After everyone had gone home and the cottage was quiet again, Clara sat on the front porch alone. The lighthouse was still going. She could see the beam from the porch, its slow, certain arc above her. The harbor was dark and still. The December stars were brilliant and cold overhead. She was holding the last logbook. Her father's last winter, his last months. She'd been reading it slowly, a page or two a day, the way you read something you want to last. She opened it to a page near the end. Early spring, or what passes for it here. Ice still on the inner harbor, but the lobster boats are out. Good to see them moving. The lighthouse has been dark for so long I sometimes forget to look at it at night. I should try to get someone to tend the light more properly. I'll ask Eli. Clara sent a card for my birthday. First time in 5 years. It was a simple card, just a picture of a lighthouse on the front, and her handwriting inside. "Still thinking of you, Dad. See." I put it on the shelf above the stove where I can see it from the table. I've been thinking a lot about how we tell the people we love that we love them. Seems like humans have about 40 ways to say it, and none of them are quite equal to the thing itself. The light is one way. The light says it pretty well. I think I'll paint the lighthouse one more time. The last entry was dated April 3rd. It was 4 lines long. Clear and cold and very beautiful this morning. Walked to the harbor before dawn. The light just coming up over the water, turning everything gold. The lobster boats going out in a line, their lights ahead of them in the dark. I stood on the pier for a long time. The harbor looked exactly like it always has. Everything I've ever loved is here or has come from here. I think that's enough. I think that's more than enough. Clara closed the logbook. She held it in both hands in the cold night air. The lighthouse beam swept over her, slow and certain, on its way out across the water. She sat there for a long time, feeling the cold and the quiet and the starlight, feeling the house warm at her back, feeling the harbor dark and steady below, feeling the particular grief and gratitude of being somewhere you've come back to, the grief for what was lost in the years of being away, and the gratitude, enormous and simple, for still being here, for having made it back to the high ground while the light still burned. After a while she went inside, made a cup of tea, and began to write in a new composition notebook she'd bought from the general store. She wrote at the top of the first page, December, Pelican Cove, and then below it in her own handwriting, not quite as cramped or as precise as her father's, but close. The lighthouse is lit again. I am home. She wrote for an hour, the cottage quiet around her, the lighthouse beam sweeping out and back, steady as a heartbeat, patient as the sea. Outside, Pelican Cove kept doing what it had always done, holding its people, tending its water, keeping its lights on against the dark. And the dark, as it always has and always will, eventually gave way to the morning. Sleep well tonight wherever you are. May your lights find you when you need them. May you always know the way back home. If this story settled something quiet inside you tonight, if it felt a little like coming home, then you're in the right place. Lantern Lake Stories is here every week with another tale told by Lantern Light. Stories about people finding their way back to themselves and to each other. Subscribe so you never miss one. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might need a quiet harbor tonight. Wherever you are in the world right now, I hope you sleep peacefully. I hope the light finds you, and I'll see you next time right here by the lantern. Good night.